Hello, I'm Kate Fitzgerald from the Learning Hack team, welcoming you to a new season of Great Minds on Learning. In this series, Donald Clark, the internationally famous author, blogger and entrepreneur, joins John Helmer to explore 2,500 years of thought and theorising about learning from the Greeks to the geeks. This time, Donald and John discuss a group of theorists who extended the scope of learning theory beyond the individual. They examined how it functions within teams, families, social networks, and society as a whole.
To date on this podcast, we've mostly talked about theorists who inquire into how individuals learn, but this time we're looking more at learning in the context of groups of people, not just individuals. We're looking at team dynamics and the social context of learning. Donald, can you tell us about the lineup you've assembled for us today and the beliefs and interests that make them cohere as a group for you?
Sure, yeah. So I think it's important right at the start to make a distinction between social learning, the sort of social learning that might be associated with social constructivists like Piaget or Vygotsky, Brunner, I think they were focusing on something quite separate from this group, which looks at groups and teams, especially in the workplace, but also, of course, in sport and in schools and education. So the people we're going to look at today are going to be Belbin, who was trying to define the very nature of teams themselves, the different roles, that not people, but roles that people have in teams. He was incredibly influential in terms of the impact on workplace learning. Salas is more concerned with the training of teams. What makes a good team tick, and how do you get them motivated, and how do you structure them and train them to get things really moving, a group or a team? And then Wenger widened it out somewhat into communities of practice. In other words, people like coders, for example, or programmers, have a community of practice that might be online and quite wide, but that's like a horizontal structure from which they learn. In fact, they're quite homogeneous, not heterogeneous like a team. So we'll have a look at Wenger's communities of practice. And lastly, one of my favorite psychologists, and that's Judith Harris, who, as Steven Pinker said, revolutionized psychology. He thinks she's one of the greatest psychological minds living today. So that we'll end on that. But this is very much about teams, group dynamics, the practical side of social learning.
And did you miss out Julian Stodd in there?
And of course, Julian. Yeah, well, how could I miss Julian? So Julian definitely, in a sense, widening it out even further, because Julian's view is that we do live in the social age, and that ignoring the social dimension, not only in teams and groups, and the dynamic within organizations, and he explores lots of different facets of this. So he's perhaps the widest theorist of all in this group. So how could I forget Julian? Great.
Shall we kick off with Meredith Belbin, 1926 to still among us, a Brit. Yeah. Studied classics, then psychology at Clare College, Cambridge. I was interviewed at Clare College, Cambridge, but they didn't want me. No hard feelings, bastards. In the late 60s, it's the narcissistic wound, Donald. We may cover that when we get to Freud. In the late 60s, he studied team dynamics in the Administrative Staff College at Henley-on-Thames, as it was then called. Published this work in 1981, and it became famous. From his research, he found that there were 9 team roles, and I'm going to list them now so you don't have to do it from memory. That's always very impressive, Donald. Resource investigator, team worker, coordinator, plant, and we're not talking about a cheese plant there.
Yeah.
Monitor, evaluator, specialist, shaper, implementer, completer, finisher. And I know everybody's now thinking, oh, which one of those am I? Donald, I almost felt for a moment that we were back in similar territory to our previous episode, Assessors, where we were looking at personality types and Myers-Briggs and Jungian personality types and so on. But it's not like that, is it? This is different. It's more about how people function as part of a team. So how did Belbin arrive at these team roles, and what significance have they had for learning?
Yeah, well, I think it's quite important to put this in today people, when they think of teams, the first word that comes to mind is diversity of teams. The premise behind Belbin's 9 roles is the idea that teams should be heterogeneous and not homogeneous. Because what he found when he went into organizations, just empirically, that everybody seemed to be very similar, you know, whether it's all advisors in number 10 went to Oxbridge, for example. And you can clearly see how people get into a sort of groupthink, ignoring the views of others, dynamic in teams and groups when they are heterogeneous. But this is, we can perhaps come to this later, but this is not the diversity issue in many ways. You know, we can come to that towards the end. This is very much about defining abstract roles independently of personality types, even independently of gender, race, socioeconomic background, and so on. And the empirical evidence that he looked at here gave him 9 clusters of behaviors. You might call them clusters statistically. And it's not that these are roles, remember, they're not, they're not individuals. Typically, we have 9 roles, which he's identified, or 9 clusters of behaviors. But the team could be as few as 3 or 4 people. They just have maybe 3, 4, sometimes 1, sometimes 4 of these roles. So these are roles, not people, heterogeneous, not homogeneous clusters of behavior. That's Belbin's thing, as it were, his shtick. The team roles are, as you said, quite interesting. And, these have been applied a lot over the years. And I think there's some rigidity, which we can come to at the moment, in the team roles, but they're certainly interesting. And so, you've got these, you start with this sort of person who's out there, this resource instigator. I quite like that the person who's full of enthusiasm, makes contacts within the organization or even with customers to get feedback and so on. That's quite interesting, right? Normally quite extrovert person that would be. But he also looks at the negatives associated with each of these roles, because these people can be incredibly enthusiastic, but they're not very good at sticking to the task and finishing. Yeah. So you got that first one, the resource investigator, which is an interesting one. Then the team worker is the sort of bonder, the glue who gels and brings the team together. And they're important because they're the sort of listener, trying to avoid friction, smooth the path out amongst the team. And there's always somebody in a team who, if they're good at that, they are invaluable. But they tend to be not sometimes to take unpopular decisions or do things that are a bit tough. They can go with the flow a little bit. So resource investigator, teamwork are the second one. Now the coordinator is, what are the objective? Who's doing what? They are bringing together people, but moving it forward. They're sort of, they're identifying the talent. They're motivating the team, clarifying the goals. Where are we going here, guys? They can sometimes be seen as a bit manipulative, pushy, even the coordinators. And then there's that weird one you mentioned. You're right, it shoots out at you, the plant. Now, the plant, Belbin thought was quite important because they're the sort of catalyst or maybe creative problem solver. Not the sort of person that's good at detail of incidentals within the team, but somebody when you've got a big problem, a big roadblock, perhaps gets you around or pivots the team towards another direction because it's necessary. That's the plant. And then you have another really important role, which is the monitor or evaluator. And they're the people who really have to keep an eye on the team. It's that objective decision maker, monitoring, project management type person who makes sure that certain things are done by a certain date and so on. And I think the evaluator, they sometimes, they're not the driver of the team. They're the sort of person who's reflective about the team. And then the specialist is what we sometimes in the learning world we call a subject matter expert. They're the people who bring the expertise to the table and the specialist knowledge. They can be very single-minded, but very useful. That's your well of knowledge and skills that you got to in terms of the goals of the team. But as we know with SMEs in the learning world, they don't have the expertise in terms of team dynamics. They can very often, in learning, for example, even though the principle in the psychology of learning is less is more, they're the sort of people who believe that more is more. Just give them more and more content, and people will learn. So that's the specialist or SME role, subject matter expert. And then the shaper. The shaper is an odd one. I think there's some overlap with this. I have some problems with Belbin here, but the shaper is the person who's driving the team forward, making sure that the thing keeps moving, doesn't lose that drive. It keeps the train on the track, but also keeps the foot in the pedal to make sure it's going at some speed. And these sometimes they can be a bit brash, and people they can hack people off a little bit in teams, but they're driving it forward. And that's sometimes necessary as well. Teams are not necessarily about just keeping people happy all the time. As we know from, let's say, sport, it's about drive, the willingness to win and get things done. Then you have, forgotten, the implementers. So they're practical, reliable people. There's efficient players in the teams. They're the people who are just, pragmatic. They have a workable strategy, practical, reliable. It's that efficiency is their kick, really. But they can be a bit inflexible and slow to respond to new possibilities. They're on the railway track. They're not going to come off the track very easily. That's the implementer. And then the big one, the last one, is the one that people probably remember most from Belbin. That's, they say, oh, he's not a completer, he's not a finisher, or she's not a completer, not a finisher. And the completer finisher is quite important, and the one that really, there's a good reason people have picked up on this, because it's often the weakness in a team. The person, you need somebody who's good on detail, searches out all the flaws and errors, polishes, perfects, also quality control to make sure this thing is right, whatever it is, maybe a product, when it's launched. They'd be quite conscientious, but incredibly important members of the team. So they've got these 9 roles, and they've proved to be quite efficacious. It's a business, the Belbin business, as it were, which they run, his relatives and so on. So there's a bit of marketing stuff around it. And I suspect that it's not as scientific as they would say. But I think it serves and has served a very useful role in terms of teasing out these strands of team roles.
How much did you find this accorded with your experience because you've led an organisation and dealt with management issues and teams and so on? Did it ring true in actual practice for you?
Yes, I think it did. Let's take some real example. You can take the example of this podcast, for example. Now I'm just coming into the podcast as a subject matter expert, playing that role in the team. But I know, John, that you have somebody who's doing the planning and the scheduling. You have communication with me about when this is going to happen. You yourself are an enabler here in terms of the whole project. You have an editor. You have somebody who does the graphics. Then you've got to do all the marketing afterwards and so on. So much people, the simplicity of a simple podcast as a delivery, for example, this one belies the complexity of the team behind the scenes, and they all have different skills. And as you know, different roles. And you're often trying to choose people who've got the right fuel mixture of these. Now, when I was running, quite large organizations, and I've also been on the boards, interestingly, of a lot of very large organizations, you find that they are more heterogeneous than you would want them to be. And again, avoiding, it's that's separate from the diversity issue. There's the diversity issue is sometimes a bit of a distraction here around this issue of team building, because there's a really excellent Harvard Business Review article in 2020 by Eli, I can't remember the name, Eli and Thomas. Because the thing about diversity is not that if you have more people of color, women, and so on, that the people who have rightly been wronged in this mix, that it will lead to increased financial performance. There's no empirical evidence for that at all. And these are the people, Eli and Thomas, who have done most of the major research in the field. But it does matter in terms of the dynamic of the team. So Eli and Thomas are interesting in diversity. Diversity isn't the main goal here. Actually, the main goal here is getting the right mixture of heterogeneity into a team to make it work. And so I think my feeling and my experience in running companies and being on boards is that this Belbin thing definitely works. But it's so hard to do because you have to really go for a process. It's not a training issue. It's a process around recruitment. Another thing in my life that's been interesting is my son is an athlete. He's in the England team for Taekwondo. He's been training all this weekend because of a big competition coming up, the Euros and then the World Cup, travels all over the world doing this. But I've gone along to a lot of the England team training sessions. That's an interesting thing to watch because it's so intense with regard to the team dynamic. And they're very keen on, sport is an amazing thing. The sheer amount of effort, money, coaching that goes into the team dynamic. It's the place where you can find a lot of the empirical theory about efficacy in teams. The same is true in the military, for example, with after-action reviews and so on. So I think whatever area of human endeavor you look at, whether it's a team in a hospital, whether it's in the military, whether it's in sport, or generally in business, the sort of Belbin principle applies.
You could say the same with rock bands as well. Yeah.
Yeah,
drummers, bass players obviously have a different job, but also within the group dynamics, you have people who do, I think I did a lot of the shaping, because I was all the person that led the rehearsals and so on in my particular group. And then you have other people, complete a finisher. It's usually an engineer or a producer or, or someone like that, you know, maybe someone outside the band. But you do find that dynamic as well in groups. Used to. It's changed. It's different now, but there you go. Donald, how has Belbin fared over the years? Because it's 1981 he first published this, and I know he's very popular around the turn of the century. Is he still, I mean, are the Belbin
I think Belbin
roles still popular, still work?
Yeah, well, of course, Belbin himself had been in his 90s, but his family have taken over that business. There's a Belbin businesses around individuals, teams, the workplace, and so on. And I think it's lasted because it's fundamentally sort of quite sensible and a good way of delivering training into organizations. Not so much the training issue, we'll come to that with Salas, but more, this is how you structure teams. This is the roles. Because the performance of teams very often determines the success of a business now. So becoming a bigger deal, the integration, collaborative nature of teams. So I think it still lasted. It would be fair to say that brand of the word Belbin has come off the boil somewhat, but I think that's okay because other people have come to the fore. And of course, we're about to discuss those.
Let's get on to Eduardo Salas. Problem with living people is you very often don't have many details about them, so I don't know when he was born, but he's still alive. He was born and raised in Peru. Eduardo Salas is an American industrial and organizational psychologist and human factors psychologist. He studied at ODU, joined the US Navy as a senior research psychologist and head of the Training Technology Development branch of the US Naval Air Systems Command in Orlando. He is the Alan R. and Gladys M. Klein Chair Professor in the Department of Psychological Sciences at Rice University in Texas. Doesn't quite win the prize for the longest job title we've ever had on this podcast, but he's certainly up there. Salas is known for his work on teamwork, including work with NASA on training astronauts to go to Mars.
Yeah.
And he found 7 drivers for teamwork, which all begin with the letter C. I think in a previous episode, you called out lists that begin with C, but let's see how we get on with this one. Capability, cooperation, coordination, communication, cognition, coaching, and conditions. Donald, does he build on Belbin's work, or is he looking at something different entirely?
Yeah, he's building, but this is different. Whereas Belbin was looking at the roles within teams, Salas is looking at how you train teams. I mean, his observation, the reason that he spent so much time and a lifetime really in looking at the training and dynamic of teams is that, you know, no matter where a team is, whether it's online or offline, increasingly online these days, virtual teams, of course, he found that they were mostly what he called suboptimal. In other words, they weren't really performing as they should, full of friction, full of problems teams. And so he was tackling not so much the roles in teams, but how you train teams to make them better, the processes, the training, the increasing in performance, even the saving of money, so you're not losing money in an organization, or even in the case, I mean, he was in the military, even in the case of, let's say, healthcare or the fire service, emergency services, the military, even in the sense of saving lives. He's done a lot of work in that area. And rightly so, because the military are one area where a huge amount of time has been spent honing the concept of optimal teams. So he's very different from Belbin in that sense, yeah. And then you have those drivers, of course. You're absolutely right. I'm always deeply suspicious of lists that begin with the same letter, and that's usually C in training. You know, the real world is just never that alliterative. It's just statistically weird. But I think, to be fair to Salas, his 7 sort of C words actually come out of some other topics that are quite interesting. You know, that whole notion of a team having, so the dynamics of a team are slightly different from Belbin. He doesn't concentrate on roles, but he does concentrate on other contextual issues like cooperation. You know, do people have the right attitudes within a team to make it work? Or the coordination, do they have the right trained behaviors to make the team work. You know, you might not have to do what you would like to do, but behave as a team member. Communications between team members, that was incredibly important. And if you've ever been in a team, you'll know that that can be, a life and death issue in terms of success. And then there's just, what do the team members know? Do they know what their roles are? Do they know what they're doing? Do they have the right skills and that sort of stuff? And then there's the coaching thing, all that leadership behaviors stuff. I'm less bothered by that one. But the big one, I think, is conditions. Do you have the favorable conditions? Is the organization team ready? Is the context right? Does it give you the right tools, let's say Microsoft Teams or Slack or whatever, structures, the reward system and so on. So you looked at this big picture of teams, what optimizes team performance? That would be a good way of putting it. And some of the stuff is really interesting here. A concept that arose really in Salas, it's come at the fore now, is psychological safety. The idea that if you're in a team, you should feel confident enough or safe enough to be able to criticize things that are going on. A good team is very open in terms of communications, going back to what we'll see. So creating a context where every member of the team feels confident in criticizing or saying, no, let's not do that, do it this way. That collective responsibility was a real driver for Salas, the psychological safety thing. And he also found interestingly in his research that one of the dangers is dropping a sort of star performer in or parachuting somebody into a team who is massively disruptive and destroys the dynamic. And that happens a lot. You can see that with, the superheads in schools, for example. Yeah, it's great, but, the evidence suggests that it can be more destructive than constructive. So, he really had a deep dive into the characteristics of what makes a good team. And I think his research is really excellent in this area. He really nails it, I think.
And team dynamics, really, rather than...
Team dynamics, yeah. And another thing I liked about his team, it's very practical as advice. So it's not only about having, purposes, goals, roles, responsibilities, and so on. And this shared understanding is an interesting one. The team has to all buy into a vision. It's like a mini company within a company, a mini like a band. They have to be very clear about their musical direction, their fiscal direction, when they're going to go on tour, when they're not. As a collective unit. But he has this really interesting thing that comes out of the military. In the military, call it after action reviews, AARs. So if you've been on a mission or a task, then you stop afterwards and you evaluate what you've done, where you really have that absolute honesty. What went wrong there, guys? Let's be honest here. And so he's big on huddles and debriefs. You find this is happening a lot in Scrum type behavior in the IT world, where teams get together very regularly, first thing in the morning or on a planned basis, to discuss the progress of the project and be very honest about what's not working. So huddles and debriefs was one of his big things. They're sharing information, getting these optimal performance criteria in terms of policies and so on.
Yeah, so it sounds like it's relevant to movements like Agile and so on.
Very much so, yeah. I think in many ways, the Agile movement came out of this. In a project, what's the forward-moving dynamic in a project? Should it be more waterfall structure? Sometimes that's necessary if you need to get legal sign-off on a project, or it's very staged with stage gates.
So with Salas and Belbin to an extent, we're kind of in the world of organizational development. Is it stretching the definition of learning to call this learning theory, do you think?
No, well, Salas in particular he sees training, all his theory is directed towards the training of teams. He thinks you should be interventionist and come in and get these things sorted, and that teams are very rarely self-sufficient unless they're very experienced. And of course, most teams are not because they're younger employees or whatever, they're a mixture of people. But both those figures, Belbin and Salas, are very much in the training world, very much in the learning world. Their theory comes from that, as opposed to abstract theory about teams and team building.
So, moving on. Étienne Wenger, 1952, and still alive, grew up in the French-speaking part of Switzerland, which is the reason I suppose he has those first and second names seem to be to our ears of different nationalities. Studied at University of Geneva and University of California, where he now lives. He was approached by John Seeley Brown, a name which will be familiar to learning theory wonks, to join the Institute for Research of Learning. And it was there that Wenger did the work he's best known for on communities of practice, in collaboration with anthropologist Jean Lave, or Lave, I'm not sure how you pronounce that, which came out of observing apprenticeships among traditional tailors in Africa. Mm-hmm. Communities of practice has been a very popular idea in e-learning and knowledge management circles. Donald, is it popular with you, and how does it move our understanding of social learning along?
Yes, it's very relevant in that it's a completely different dimension to teams in learning here. So you have this sort of horizontal spread amongst a homogeneous group of people. So let's say the tailors in Africa, or apprentices in a particular guild in the Middle Ages or whatever. And this is built on, an anthropological or sociological observation that these groups of people who are in a community of practice, they all do the same thing, basically, learn a lot from each other, hence the term community of practice. Mm. And so the anthropological, Jean Lavie, she plucked that out of the historical analysis or anthropological analysis of teams and found that actually these community practices have existed throughout history. However, there is a slight problem with this in that the world has changed somewhat. We don't really have an apprenticeship system of learning these days, master apprentice. So perhaps this theory is of less interest than the first two we mentioned, but it's nevertheless got lots of traction. Étienne Wenger is quite famous. This notion that this group of people have all these skills and knowledge in common. The groups I know most about, of course, are tech groups. So you have coders, for example, who see themselves as quite a group in itself. They very often are self-skilling. They have these resources like GitHub and all sorts of tools and so on. They're quite self-sufficient, but they see that they have an identity as a group or a profession. And this extends not only within an organization, let's say all the engineers in a telco, but also outside of the organization into maybe the trade associations that they're members of. So communities of practice, whether they're online or offline, increasingly online these days, are these wide, homogeneous communities that learn within the group. And I think there's definitely something in this. But I think it's a mistake to regard that as the be-all and end-all in terms of group and team dynamics. I think apprenticeship groups, upon which all this was based, are much rarer these days, and that we have far more cross-network structures and teams. This is the weakness of the community practice thing. In fact, there's a great danger of groupthink, or the coders getting together and thinking that they're king of the hill and that all these other people in the team, like the graphic designers and so on, are beneath contempt or whatever. You can get negativity around communities of practice as well. And it's not clear that the social context that he goes on about is as important, I think, as the internal dynamics of teams and groups. So there's a sense in which his theory of learning squeezes everything into this community of practice social box. And I think that's a weakness of the theory. Nevertheless, when you're dealing with social learning and groups of practice, there is an immense amount of very specific training that happens within one domain or one area of learning, let's say coding, or in the case of my son, Taekwondo. He's just spent the whole weekend training. During the week, it'll be 4 nights in the gym it's an intense, very specific form of training around the team he's a member of. So I think that's where Wenger's community of practice is still important. Another dimension entirely around social groups and teams and organizations.
I'd certainly come across that with coders. I was in an organization once where we decided we'd get Yammer in as a common kind of messaging tool for everyone to use. And half the people in this company, or more than half, were coders. And they pushed back against this because they used IRQ and they weren't going to budge from that. And we discovered in the course of this that they weren't only using it to communicate with each other, but to their community of practice externally. So if any of them ran into a problem they couldn't fix, they'd get on IRQ and ask someone in that extended network and get the answer straight back, which is kind of learning the flow of work, if you like. Other places I've seen it a lot. I think you see this in the professions, kind of lawyers, solicitors, doctors, And a lot happens around conferences and stuff like that. There's a kind of socialization within a profession that goes on, and you see that in certain kind of clubs as well. Musicians do it, artists, writers, authors. I've been to for years, been to a writer's retreat, which is also as an element of kind of community around it. People will swap information about, how much should you get paid for this? How much should your agent be taking or not taking? Aren't publishers terrible? Blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
So that's my bit on communities of practice.
Yeah, it's an interesting list you gave there, and I suppose that teases out the problem with community as well as its benefits. One of the problems, it was a famous quote, that all professions are a conspiracy against the laity, yeah. because they tend to be inward-looking and, just almost ignoring you as a customer. If you've dealt with lawyers, for example, I think that's one group where their communication is awful, they never meet deadlines, it can be a magnificently horrific experience dealing with that world because they see their form of practice as being rock solid, and they tend to ignore the customer. But I think this notion of a community of practice being inclusive is a good thing, like the coders and the example you gave there. But at the same time, its inclusivity means it's, in terms of the group, means that it excludes other people outside of the group. And your example of Yammer, whether it's Slack or anything that people try and implement, let's say even as a learning dimension, you always have these divisions because people are already using something in their own homogeneous group, community of practice, but actually you want a vertical group as well. It's a very good book on this by Neil Ferguson called The Tower and the Square. In other words, you always get this agora dynamic, let's say a flat, decentralized structure, but at the same time, you get a tower, which is a hierarchical structure, but you've also got to recognize that matters and is important as well.
Yeah, I think very often when people try to implement a community of practice using technology within an organization, you discover that what they discover is that there is one already there and they're not in it.
That's right.
So Julian Stodd, quite a lot about him on the internet, but in certain ways enigmatic, no dates, unknown to Wikipedia. A Brit, he studied at Bournemouth University. He's on the faculty at the University of Pennsylvania Graduate School of Education. He's the author of at least 14 books, and he's the captain and founder of Sea Salt Learning, a global learning consultancy helping organizations adapt and thrive in the social age. And the social age is one of his big phrases. I saw him speaking on the Learning Leaders Global Online Forum, where he said he wrote a book about learning science and didn't publish it. As you and I know, it's a pretty difficult subject today, which is hence this podcast. He says that people trust social technologies more than the ones supplied by their organizations. This was something he said on the conference. Including some they are often explicitly forbidden from using at work, which I think is an interesting reflection. Yeah. But Donald, you know a lot more. You've read a lot more of his stuff. Donald, can you tell us about his idea of the social age and social leadership, what it's all about, and what do you feel he contributes?
Yeah, well, the good news here is I know Julian. He's a friend of mine, and I'm a big admirer of Julian's. He's quite an unusual figure in this landscape, but he has a relentless focus on what he calls the big picture. He thinks we live in the social age, and that is partly to do with technology, but partly to do with the nature of organizations where the social dimension has become more important. So, he's devoted his life so far to examining, unpicking. He is an archaeologist by background interest, and I often think that he's almost like one of those people who dig deep into the past to shape the future in terms of learning theory, and specific the social learning theory. And he's written 14 books, but he's unusual in another respect in that he practices what he preaches. So he believes in humility and trust. So you'll quite often see him both in his written work and also when he's speaking at conferences and so on, quite literally say, listen, everything I do is in beta, it's half completed, unfinished, it's a work in progress. And so he's very honest about that, which I find admirable. And he also has quite a lot of focus on personal journeys, and this has been, he tends not to write very academic books. He tends to talk about the sort of journeys people go on. Journeys through these, he uses landscape as a metaphor a lot. In other words, we're moving through the social landscape. What are the features of this landscape? How do we navigate through the social world that we find ourselves in? And in that way, I think I certainly and others have found him very enlightening on this. Generally, we have to start with Julian. You always have to think of this big picture social age. He does believe that, the social context in which we exist is the dominant paradigm of the age, as it were. And that for organizations have to recognize this, that there's more than just the social context of the workplace, for example. There's the social context of your family, of the groups you're a member of outside of work. So it's a much bigger issue, all these social relationships, communities that we're part of. That's a big thing for Julian. And I think those social structures, an understanding of those social structures, and therefore how can you improve organizational development by paying attention to this? A good example of social leadership, that leadership training, which I'm often not fond of. But I think, to be fair to Julian, he has a very clear view of social leadership based on, he focuses very much on human qualities as opposed to personality types or whatever. Things like humility and trust, kindness. He thinks that those are admirable traits in organizations. But he's not very abstract in this. He produces these guidebooks, which are very concrete ways in which you, as a manager or an individual in an organization, can navigate the social landscape. So I think, although it sounds vague, he can be very, very precise when he wants to be. And so, he has very specific things around his theories for this around curation, storytelling, sharing, the notion of authority and reputation, trust, humility. All those things really matter to him, and he takes deep dives into these things, not at all shallow. Trust, for example, trust and humility are two big things generally in his theory. And he often talks about having humility to listen in a social context. And that what really matters are these subtle dimensions in this new social world we find ourselves in, as opposed to the rather fractious, binary, conflicted nature of social media, for example. He thinks that having the humility to listen is perhaps the quality we should be encouraging more. And he's very specific again on that. It's 12, take trust, for example. Excuse me. He really drills down into the different dimensions of the trust. It's where I take some issues. We have, although I know him as a good friend of mine, we disagree on a number of things. He thinks that trust is fundamental here in terms of trusting the technology, trusting the creativity of others, allowing for failure, ethnicity, a whole track of things here. Whereas I'm less enamored with those, with things like trust and humility as the actual real drivers in a business or leadership. I think sometimes when you're running, let's say, a large public limited company, you can't be as transparent and as trustworthy as you should be because your competition's there and you've got your share price and there are all sorts of dimensions of a business means that it's not as simple as you might imagine. So I take some issue with that, but I think in general, his work on social learning and being careful, he's very careful not being over prescriptive. We've been through Belbin, who has these 9 roles. We have been through the 7 C's from
the 7 C's.
From Salas. When you come to Julian Stodd, he doesn't really do this so much. He prefers the word mindset to more. He doesn't really like models or methods. And I think there's something admirable in this, the fluidity of thinking in a social age. So in that sense, he practices what he preaches. But he can be very precise. I read a really good book called To the Moon and Back, which explores the Apollo mission, discussing how the social dynamic and group and team dynamics meant that we did actually get somebody to the moon. How amazing was that, and it was all about, the themes in the book are all about how complex this thing was, how they had lots of failure and had to live with failure, but it was important that they had that ambition and drive as well. So he describes himself as a storyteller, and that's one excellent story in which he exhibits both his own thoughts on social learning, but also through a real case study. Right. He calls it he uses the tense, it's a good phrase, sense making. He said you've got to navigate the social landscape by making sense and making meaning from it as an individual. Now, I suppose my beef with, it was not beef actually, with Julian, we discussed this a lot, but I'm on the other side of the coin. I tend to be more evidence and research-based person, And so anything Julian says, I like to look at the evidence side of it as well. But the great thing about Julian is how open he is. He has real humility. You know, if you challenge him, he will genuinely listen and take things on board. So I think he's I think the most interesting theorist in this area, but more importantly, one of the more interesting practitioners in the area. Because what is theory without practice?
What's going to be my question is, are you open to attack? Because unlike people like Belbin, it's not based on empirical observation in a scientific sense, although obviously he's hands-on and works with a lot of big organizations and so on.
Yes, he does.
But he's more of a pure theorist.
He's definitely not against empirical observation. You know, he's very open to it, but sees it as one dimension as opposed to the dimension. Whereas I perhaps put more weight on that than Julian. But I think Julian has a point here. He runs these big, almost like communities of practice. He runs a big quiet leadership course. We have hundreds of thousands of people on these things sometimes. And I think people get a lot out of it because it's a reflective process. And he thinks, again, that's part of this trust and humility kick in social learning, which I would agree with.
Come quite a long way from Belbin to Julian, I think, there. And now we're going in a slightly different direction, but it is a kind of opening up of the thing from organizations into wider society with Judith Harris, 1938 to 2018. It is dangerous to claim that parents have no power at all other than genetic to shape their child's personality, intelligence, or the way he or she behaves outside the family home, wrote Judith Harris in 2006. And she went on, a confession. When I first made this proposal 10 years ago, I didn't fully believe it myself. I took an extreme position, the null hypothesis of zero parental influence, for the sake of scientific clarity. The establishment's failure to shoot me down has been nothing short of astonishing. It's a great quote, that. Born in Brooklyn, she had a peripatetic childhood, attended University of Arizona and Brandeis, and then was dismissed from the PhD program at Harvard because her work was not up to Harvard standards. She researched visual information processing. Then after 1981 focused on developmental psychology, leading in the 1990s to a new theory of child development that won her the APA's George A. Miller Award. The irony here being that George A. Miller, who we covered in our Cognitivists episode, was the chair of the psychology department that kicked her out of Harvard. Donald, Harris's theory will strike a chord with many who, like myself, have been the parent of teenage children. What did she tell us about how they learn?
Okay. Well, I like you. I mean, Judith Harris, I've written over 200 profiles of learning theorists, and Judith Harris is easily in my top 5. I'm a huge admirer of her work because I think it's one of the areas of learning theory that is perhaps almost completely ignored, but is of huge relevance and practical importance. And I'll maybe explain why I do think that's true. But I'm not alone there. Steven Pinker, who arguably has the biggest chair in psychology on the planet at Harvard, sees her book, The Nurture Assumption, as actually a complete turning point in the history of psychology. That's how he described it. He thinks she's one of the most important psychologists living today. And she's also rather unusual. As you say, she got rejected from Harvard by George Miller, of all people. And then on top of that, she was a grandmother, suffered badly, had children, suffered from chronic illness and so on, but came back with this amazing body of research, largely done on her own outside of the institutional context. Now, so what is this body of work that I so admire? And it's all in 2 books, the first being The Nurture Assumption. And the subtitle of the book is quite interesting because it's something, why do children turn out the way they do? And it's all to do with parents don't matter as much as you think they do. Peers, this is about peer learning. So that's the adjective we've got to hang our hat on when we discuss Judith here. Her first observation comes from linguistics, which is that immigrant children, for example, do not have the accent of their parents. This may seem trivial. So my kids do not have Scottish accents, despite the fact that I have a strong Scottish accent, as does my wife. So, and we've been 37 years here in Brighton, and yet our kids were born and bred in Brighton, and of course don't have Scottish accents. She used this observation to come up with a hypothesis. because they pick up the language and accent, of course, from their peer groups. This is the key thing. That's where they get the language from. And she thought, could this be true more generally in terms of their personalities, their behaviors, and so on? And it turns out through twin studies and a lot of really dedicated research, yet this is indeed the case. And even when children behave like their parents, there's this illusion that came through in the, the Spock books and so on, that parents really matter with regard to how the kids turn out, because that was the orthodoxy. It turns out that something quite interesting was going on here, that children behave like their parents because they're genetically related to them, not because the parents treat them in any special way, but just because they've got their parents' genes. So there's this illusion that the parents are, teaching the kids to be in such a way, but it's actually the genetic component, or some nonsense about childhood trauma from Freud. She really hammers Freud and all this stuff. So what sort of conclusions did she come to? Well, when you look at the pie chart, as it were, of what influences affect outcomes in young people especially, she reckons about 50% of it's genetic, in terms of their personality type, especially dispositions, traits, and so on. But what about the other 50%? It's not parents at all. In fact, she reckons that's as low as 4 or 5%. 45%, she thinks, the really manipulable bit, the interesting bit that we should be paying attention to, especially in education, is peer pressure. Peer pressure. Now, if you've ever, as you rightly said there, if you've ever had teenage boys or girls, you will know deep in your heart, you're probably scarred by the fact that this happened in front of your very eyes, that peer pressure overwhelmed your children. And actually, Judith's view is that it actually stays there, the notion of peer groups. And this is what she called that's why she called it the nurture assumption. Don't imagine for 1 minute that you as a parent has really a huge influence on here. So it's probably best illustrated by a real example in education, because she talked about peer pressure generally. But if you take the example of schools, so when your kids go, especially in secondary school, you find that, the secondary schools are full of kids, if you're a teacher, kids playing up. And they're playing up because they're appealing to their peer groups, and to other children in that group. These are the most important people for children. Adults and teachers are almost invisible. The most important person in a teenager's life are other teenagers, not their parents nor their teachers. And this is what you have to control in the classroom. It's the root of most behavioral problems. The sort of groupness, peer groupness, is an incredibly powerful, almost hormonal effect. Okay. Now, she thinks that the contrast effects in schools and in organization generally, if you don't pay attention to peer pressure and peer groups, you're going to get trouble because it puts wedges in between the groups and then subsequent friction between groups. So in schools, slow kids, the people who are not making much progress tend to associate with other kids who are not making progress and go into a sort of spiral loop downwards because they associate with each other, reinforce each other's feelings of failure and lack of motivation. Whereas the smart kids do the very opposite. They hang out with smart kids and therefore get better faster. So you get this wedge between two groups. And she then goes on to look at, some of it's quite tribal or to do with, how you dress or what social group or what music you like in school or whatever. Yeah. Some of it's class-based, some of it's race-based. But she thinks it's terribly important that you tackle this head on. And that what matters is changing the behavior and attitudes of these groups of children to, in a sense, dilute. You can never get rid of peer pressure, but she thinks that a unisex school uniform would be a good thing, for example. I remember when I went to China, all the schools, all the kids had the same sort of tracksuit type thing. It was a sort of, neither male nor female, because that's a huge peer group issue, the differentiation between the different type of peer pressure amongst girls at school as opposed to boys. Every teacher knows this. Every parent knows this. But attempts to homogenize or flatten out those big peaks, it seems a good thing by Judith Harris. So that's one practical thing, have a unisex school uniform. And I actually agree with that, or no uniform at all. Although again, people start dressing as their peer groups. Smaller schools, smaller class sizes, avoid peer group pressure. And then also downplaying cultural differences. And this is where she rubs up against maybe some of the more modern theory on identity politics. She thinks it's an incredibly dangerous thing. Jonathan Haidt also agrees with this, that if you exaggerate these group or differences in terms of race, socioeconomic class, gender, sexuality, you're playing a very dangerous game here, because you're shoving people, pigeonholing people into peer groups, which may be the last thing they need. It may mean that real diversity would mean not associating with people just like you, but associating with people who are very different from you. And that so she has a very outward-looking and positive view of diversity in that sense. And that, for example, teachers splitting kids up and randomizing them with regard to where they sit in the classroom. Eric Mazur does that in lectures, for example. He found there was a correlation between the people who sat in the front of the lecture hall to the back. The further back you went, the lower the attainment, until you get to the back row where they're all sitting on Facebook, of course. And so he randomized people up so they weren't sitting next to people they knew and more inclined to chat to them and reinforce groupthink. So, this is why I'm such a great admirer of Judith. I think in terms of the social dimension, she understands you can, as a parent, as a teacher, as anyone really, pick up on this and work with it.
So summing up, these people are all relatively recent by our standards. I mean, maybe I'm thinking of, we did the Enlightenment a while ago. But even with some of the other things where we come up to the present day with the theorists, they might have had an origin story that goes back to sort of William James or something. But these people are all relatively recent, I think, late 20th century. And yet social and team learning must have been going on long before the late 20th century. Why do you think it became such an area of focus at the time that it did?
Well, I think we found that, historically, a post-industrial revolution, where people could work as individuals, as it were, on a production line, let's say, we had the rise of a managerial class, which was very much team-based. People were literally managing teams. Mm-hmm. So you can see why Belbin became a necessary thing in the 80s and 90s and so on. Then, as the internet, with the advent of the internet and this notion of socially connected working, socially connected entertainment, socially connected everything, here we are sitting using a piece of software. We could be on the other side of the planet, as I was yesterday with somebody in the US, the day before somebody in South Africa. The whole social network has expanded to become a global entity. We're increasingly, of course, working at home, knowledge working and so on. So I think the social imperative, as Julian Stodd rightly identified, has become the mark of our age. Groups matter, teams matter, peer groups matter, social working matters. Now, historically, we are naturally tribal. We're probably going back to the time where Robin DeMar rightly says, actually, the number of people we can cope with cognitively maxes out about 150. But we're far more used. Yeah, that's right. And we're far more used to it. In fact, our brains have evolved to work in small social groups, family groups especially, but also slightly bigger clan type size groups. So it doesn't surprise me that a lot of this research is confirming that, what evolutionary psychology suggests, that teams and groups and cognitively is what we can cope with. But how do we optimize that type of behavior? Because we find ourselves in the social age. Now, I think there's another dimension which I mentioned briefly during here. I think the mistake is to rush at some other abstract issues and not get very practical about this around diversity, for example. Diversity is a good thing, but if you think, for example, that the causality is if we just have a diverse board, we will make more money. Again, the research just does not substantiate this at all. In fact, there's no evidence at all that just having more women, more people from other ethnic backgrounds on your board necessarily makes you fiscally better, but it does make your teams more dynamic and more interesting and prepares you for the future in many ways. So increasing diversity does not in itself increase effectiveness. What matters is how the organization harnesses that diversity and whether it's willing to reshape the power structure of an organization, this promise of financial gain, I think people are shooting themselves in the foot when they go for that. The studies show that diverse teams realize performance benefits, but when you look at the team dynamics, and that's when diversity comes into play. So I think we have a lot to learn from these theorists because empirically they've looked hard at these problems and are coming up with solutions that are not glib, not ideological, but quite practical. And I think that's what's really needed here. In fact, the evidence would suggest that if you just focus, for example, on, if we just get a diverse team, it will increase fiscal performance. If the fiscal performance doesn't actually happen, you get a negative effect. And that was very interesting, because the researchers, like Eli and Thomas, when they looked at this empirically, actually, if you overpromise from diversity, then fail fiscally, you've shot yourself in the foot. It's far better to look for other goals around the social dynamic of an organization to increase diversity. So I think we have a lot to learn from these people and the bringing together of different areas in learning development and HR in such a way that it benefits everyone. That word social matters, but mostly in terms of teams, peer group, and so on.
You know the research better than I do, but didn't I see something a couple of years ago where there was some research done with the financial organizations and found that they did get a fiscal benefit from having more gender diversity? And in fact, the more cohesive the groups were in terms of, if everyone in the company had been to the same school, they did less well. And it was measuring how much money they actually made.
Well, the research that I know, so the article I would point you towards is the Harvard Business Review. There's a really brilliant article in 2020, I think. This is the Eli and Thomas one. And the other people who know this research inside out, but they're emphatic on this point. So they say, the claim that putting more women, let's say, on corporate boards leads to economic gains is a fallacy, that there is no evidence for this at all. In fact, when you saw it's mostly correlation and not causality, because in truth, when you actually try and look for the causality, the likeliest thing is some other factors, such as the industry size, like banks. Banks make money anyway, and they make more and more money. So it's very difficult to untangle all the factors. Just because let's say you put 2 women on the board or 2 people from anything, it doesn't necessarily mean that has caused the increased profits in that bank. So you'd have to
control for the sort of stuff that Belbin's talking about, apart from anything else. You may well have produced a much more complementary team in other ways, and it wasn't necessarily about gender.
That's exactly it, because there's so many factors that result in the fiscal performance of an organization that you've got to be very, very careful in using that as your measure. There are other measures further back in an organization that are far more useful in terms of diversity, around structure of teams, the progress of teams, how happy people are at work, treating people with respect, having all the things that Julian talked about, humility and trust and so on. There are other things in life than money, and the danger is that in tacking onto the money hypothesis, you then find that the studies show it's not true. You've suddenly demolished your main case, because the case, as all these theorists have said, is about the increased efficacy of teams, happier workplaces, and so on and so forth. So I think that's what's really useful about this group, is that they're not focused on fiscal output. They're focused on team dynamics, because the performance may not be money. The performance may very well be, the general context, the happiness people have at work, not losing people because they get unhappy at work. There are many other things in life than money.
And by the sound of it, this is a kind of an area of work, a category of thinking that is more than ever relevant. Probably will become more so.
I think, your question there was, why has this come of age? Because we live in a social age. That was spot on, that question, because I think we now find ourselves in the right context to accept this theory. Belbin is more relevant now than it was then. It was a very mechanical, instrumental theory about the roles and teams. But then if you layer on Salas's, the human factors and team dynamics, then you come in with communities of practice, then Julian Stodd's much wider view of seeing it not just as a workplace issue, but generally a societal issue, communities you're a member of, your own family, your groups. I think we're much more sensitive to those social dimensions. And then Judith Harris comes in with an arrow to the heart and said, listen, guys, it's all very well you saying all this, but in reality, what does the science say here? It actually says that a lot of what you think is social isn't social at all. Actually, the dominant force here is peer groups, which can be incredibly destructive. So this idea that being social is always a good thing is not always true. I think this is why I love Judith Harris. She punctured the hubris in that bubble, that everything should be social, and if we only make it social, everything will be fine. Well, no, because peer group is perhaps one of the more dominant sides of social behaviour and activity in schools, but it can be incredibly destructive. And every parent has probably gone through that to one degree or another, having to cope with the destructive feature of peer group pressure.
Well, thank you for that, Donald. I thought that was a really interesting episode, and it'd be great to see the feedback we get on that and other people's perspectives. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John. Pleasure as always.
Great Minds on Learning comes from the Learning Hack team and is produced by John Helmer. Sound edit is by Isaac Peacock. Social media by Jay Curtis. The podcast is based on a series of blog posts written by Donald Clark, and would like to thank Donald for his kind collaboration in this project. In the next episode, Donald and John explore effective learning. Be sure not to miss it.